So welcome everyone to today's section. We'll be looking at an introduction to SQL for data analytics. So SQL for data analysis. And SQL is very important in that most data, right, is stored in databases. And SQL is a language used to connect to data and manipulate data in databases. So for today's section, for the agenda, we'll look at what SQL is. Next, we'll look at databases and types of databases. And then we'll go through some reasons why you should learn SQL. And then we'll also see reasons why businesses in particular like databases. And then we'll look briefly at entity relationship diagrams. And lastly, we'll go through some practical work using Microsoft SQL Server. So for this section, right, you need to have Microsoft SQL Server installed and also SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll put that in the video description when it's up. So that's not a problem. I'll share how to do all that in the video description when it's up. So for the first item on our agenda, what is SQL? Now, SQL is a standard language for accessing and manipulating databases. So databases is where you store data, right? And the language used to communicate with databases is SQL. And what does SQL mean? Literally, right, is an acronym for what? Structured Query Language. So SQL stands for Structured Query Language. And it's a language, right, for accessing and manipulating databases. So let's look at some types of databases, right? So first of all, what is a database? It's simply a collection of tables that share connected data stored in a computer, right? Or a network of computers, right? So it's simply tables, right? So you have tables that contain data, right? Individual tables. So when they are not connected, they are just what? Individual tables. But when you connect them through some form of logic, right? Then it becomes what? A database. So it's simply tables that are connected together. That's what database is. And some of the common database systems, right? They include MySQL, Access Database, Oracle Database, Microsoft SQL Server, which we'll be using in this section. You also have what? PostgreSQL. So all these are different flavors of SQL, right? And they are similar, but there are some idiosyncrasies, right? A bit of differences here and there. But once you learn and master one, it's easier to just search on Google and look at the difference in syntax for doing a particular task. But then they are all similar, right? Once you master one, it's easy to replicate a function or a task in another database. So these are all examples of relational database systems. And for this section, right, we'll be working with Microsoft SQL Server. So why should one learn SQL? The first reason is that SQL is easy to understand, right? It's basically English language. So select this from this, join this to this, right? The syntax is just English language. So it's easy for you to understand what's happening, right, with the code you're writing. So that's one advantage of SQL over other languages. Is easy to understand. And then the next reason why you should learn SQL is that databases allow you to access data directly. So data is stored in databases, right? And SQL is a language used to access databases. So it means you're working with your data directly. You're writing queries from the source, right? You're seeing the results in real time. So you're working with your data directly. And then the next reason is that databases, right? It allows you to audit and replicate your data. So it helps to ensure data integrity. Integrity in that you ensure that the data you're working with, right, at all time is correct. So you're working with correct data at all times, right? That's one reason. So you can audit and ensure that data is correct, right? So for example, let's say I enter in data, right? And databases are in a way that you have someone that enters in data, right? So you have what some admin access and privileges, right? Not anyone can come in and just change data. You have someone that's given that right to change data and manipulate data. So once you put in data, right, no one can just come and change data anyhow. Is what you have people who have access to do that kind of work. And then also, right, you can also enforce constraints when trying to put in data. And we'll see all this in a bit. So all these help you to ensure that you're putting in the right data, in the right formats, in the right tables, right? So you're ensuring data integrity. And you can also replicate data across board. So all these are things you could do with databases. And then also SQL is a great tool for analyzing multiple tables at once. So with SQL, you can work with multiple tables at once using join statements, right, in your queries. So you use joins to run your queries and join multiple tables together. And these are things we'll see subsequently. So you can work with data in several tables, right, with SQL. And then another reason, right, is that with SQL, you can answer very complex questions, right? So you can delve into your data, you can slice it, dice it, group it, and work on complex questions, right? And when you compare it to other tools, right, like Google Analytics, etc., you find that you can do a lot of complex analytics, right, using SQL. So these are some reasons, right, amongst others, why you should learn SQL. Easy to understand, access data directly, you can audit and replicate your data, you can analyze multiple tables at once, and also answer complex questions with SQL. So let's look at some reasons why businesses like databases. The first reason is that databases, right, it helps to ensure data integrity. Only data you enter, right? Data you want to be entered is entered, right? And also only certain users are able to access, write, or change data in database, right? So like I said earlier, right, you have restrictions and access, right? So not anyone can just come into the database and change it. You have to have the access, right, to make changes to the database. And most times you have database administrators or data engineers that do all those changes, right? They update, write data and stuff like that. Then a data analyst or scientist will just have read-only rights. So you can only connect to and load data, right? You can't make changes. So it helps to ensure data integrity. So that's one reason why businesses like databases. So for example, let's say we are trying to work with data, right, for sales. And if anyone can just come and change data, right, Mr. A can make 5 sales and find a way to manipulate it to show 50 sales, right? But database is if it's structured correctly, it minimizes the risk of manipulating and changing data. And then the next reason, right, is that data can be accessed quickly. So with SQL, right, you can easily connect to data and do your analysis, right, there in SQL. So compared to when you're using a third-party tool, right, there might be delay or lag, right? But then with SQL directly, you can just connect your database, run queries, right? If you optimize them, they run very, very fast, right? So you can optimize your SQL queries to pull in data and get your results quickly. And then one more reason is that data is easily shared. So with a database, right, multiple people can connect to one database instance and do individual work, right? So multiple people can connect to the database and the data is the same. It won't change for Mr. A or Mr. B or Mr. C, right? They will all have the same data and work with it, right, to carry out their different tasks. And it allows for consistent results, right, with everyone who's working with the database. So these are some reasons why businesses like databases. So I'll just introduce this concept, right? We'll see more of this in a bit, but let's look at what entity relationship diagrams are. So this is simply a diagram that shows how data is structured or connected, right, in a database. So let's see an example. This is a sample database, right? You have 5 tables: web events, accounts, orders, sales reps, region. These are 5 individual tables. So without connections, right, they are just individual tables. But when you create connections, so you can see all these lines here, right? Let me annotate all these lines here, right? All these lines here is showing you what's the connection between these tables. That's what makes a database, right? When tables are connected, then you have a database. So this diagram, right, it shows you how the different tables are connected. And this is very useful. So for example, let's say you're a data analyst, right? Or data scientist or engineer, and you join a team, right? You're trying to work with data. One of the first documents you want to get hold of is the entity relationship diagram. It will show you how the different tables are connected. That way you know how to write your query, structure it to pull in the required data you need for your task, right? So here, let's try to understand what this table is showing us. So we have 5 tables: web events, accounts, orders, sales reps, region. The web events table, you have about 4 columns: ID, account ID, or call at channel. So let's look at web events and accounts, right? These 2 tables, how are they connected? So you can see this line, right? This line here. And you can also see some, let me annotate also. You can also see this stuff, right? PK, FK. We'll talk about this in a bit, but PK simply means primary key and FK means foreign key. A primary key is simply a column that identifies every row in the table, right? So the web events, right? This primary key here is what? The ID, web events ID. It identifies all the rows here uniquely. Now, how does web events connect to accounts? Is through what? The account ID. So in the accounts table, it also has its own primary key, the key that uniquely identifies every row in the table, right? So accounts table, the primary key is what? ID, accounts ID. This column also exists in the web events table as what? Account ID also. So how do we connect web events and accounts? Through their similar column, which is what? Account ID and account ID. In accounts, it's called ID, but this is the same thing as account ID, right? Account ID, account ID. So that's how it's connected, right? So the account ID in accounts table, right, is the primary key, but it also exists in this table, web events. And here now is a foreign key, right? So a foreign key is simply a column that exists as a primary key in a different table. So web events, the account ID is a foreign key because it exists in the accounts table as a primary key, right? So it might sound complicated now, but then we'll do examples subsequently and it will make more sense. So the same drill, when you go to tables also, accounts and orders, right? We have accounts ID also on the orders table. And how do we connect orders to accounts? Through their similar column, which is account ID and account ID. The same drill when you look at sales reps, right? Sales reps and accounts here also, right? The same drill also. So in the sales rep table, you have what? Sales rep ID, right? This. In the accounts table, you also have what? Sales rep ID, these two, right? So similar columns, that's how you link them. So primary key, foreign key, right? The same drill to region table, you have region ID and region ID, right? That's how they are linked also. So that's the ERD, right? For short, ERD. It shows you how tables are connected, right, in the database. Let me take all these off. So at this point, let's go to the next slide. Let's look at doing actual work, right, in Microsoft SQL Server. So the first thing, right, is to connect to your SQL Server. So once you install SQL Server, right, you need to also install SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. And that's the tool you would use to work with SQL Server. So let me share my full screen So once you install SQL Server and also install SSMS, right, you need to open the SSMS app on your laptop. So I'll come to my search bar here and you type in SSMS, right? And it opens up this tab, Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio 18. So if you work with other RDBMS, maybe Postgres, etc., right? For Postgres, this is the same as a tool like pgadmin, right? pgadmin is the client tool for Postgres. But in SQL Server, the client tool is called what? SSMS, Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So you open this up, right? Click on it, so I open it up. But I already have it open here. This is the app here, right? SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll disconnect currently. When you open it up, it would look like this, right? For you to connect or start working with it, right? You need to connect. So this charger icon, right? That's the icon used to connect. So I'll click on this icon and it opens up this tab, right? Let me go back to my slide. So here you can see a similar tab, right? SQL Server, server type, database engine, right? Then a server name. So by default, it will show your local server, right? For your laptop, right? You're working with. So this is my local server, desktop, etc., etc., etc. And then you have different ways of authentication. So you can choose SQL Server Windows. I'll explain in a bit. So let me go back to my SSMS tool. I come back here and database engine, right? So you have different other options, but then in most instances, you want to work with what database engine. Server name, right? For your local laptop, you have just your default server. If you're connecting to maybe your company's server, right? Or a different server, you just come in here and put the server name, just put the name, correct name here. Then for authentication, right? Oftentimes than not, you work with Windows authentication or SQL Server. Though I've had instances where I've worked with this Azure Active Directory, right? Integrated. But then most times you work with what engine, you work with Windows or SQL Server. Now for the Windows, this Windows option, right? This is when you're connecting to your local instance. So by default, this tool will just use your default username and password. And you can see these options, username, password, they are both grayed out, meaning that what you just use your Windows details to sign in, right? But if I choose the SQL Server option, right, you need to put a login and a password before you sign in. So you can set this up, right? But then we won't go into that. For this section, we just work with the Windows authentication. So you come on here, right, and you connect. And this opens up this. Look at let me zoom in. So if you look at this top left, right, it shows you. So it shows you the desktop, right? This is basically your server name, right? The server name is this. You can minimize this, open it up, right? You now see databases, different folders, security, object, etc. So open up databases, right? You'll see system databases and snapshots. So currently, I've not made any change to this database. It's just brand new, right? So by default, you'll see some system databases, master, model, MSDB, and TempDB. These are all databases, right, that come as a default database, right? So they come with the whole SMS package. Once you install SQL Server, all these come by default, and they help to ensure that the tool works correctly, right? So all these databases, they are here by default. For you to start working with this, you need to create your own database and then add data to it and start working with data, right? Which we'll see in a bit. So that's how to connect to the database. You connect, right? I can disconnect by clicking on the same icon. So I come in here and click on this icon, right? And it's connected. To connect back, I'll have to click on this icon again, right? And it opens up this tab and I put in my details and connect, right? So I'm back here. So let's go back to my slide. Not this. So I've explained, right? When you're working with a Windows authentication, by default, these are grayed out. Just connect. For SQL Server, right? You have to put in a login and a password. So let's talk about the SSMS, which stands for SQL Server Management Studio. So SSMS is a client tool and not the server itself. It's a tool you use to connect to SQL Server, manipulate, change, right? So to create tables, for example, or make a database, or write a query, or retrieve data, right? You use SSMS as a tool to connect to the server and make those changes. So that's what this is. It's a tool used to work with the SQL server, but not the server itself, right? So it's important to note that. And this image here, right, is showing you a sample server, database server right here. Then you have 4 different machines that are connected to this database server, right? These 4 different machines, they would use SQL Server Management Studio, the tool, right, to connect to this server, and then they can now pull in data and make their changes, right? So very important to note, SSMS is a client tool, but not the server itself. So use your machines, right? Connect to SQL with the SSMS, which stands for SQL Server Management Studio. So let's look at some actual tasks in SQL Server Management Studio, right? How can one create a database, right, from scratch? So you can do this in 2 ways, right? You can use the graphical interface in SSMS, and you can also use a query. So let's go through this. So this is my SQL Server Management Studio, right? I want to make a database. So currently, right, when I open this, I have system databases, right? And this folder for snapshots, right, which is currently empty. So I want to make a database, right? A sample database. So with the graphical interface, right, just right click, right, and make your changes. So I'll come to this folder, databases. So I come onto that folder, databases. I right click, and you see an option to make a new database, right? So I'll click on this, and it will open up a tab. Yeah, cool. So on this tab, right, you can put in your database name. So I'll call this database 1. I'll leave everything as default. I'll come down here, right? I'll come down here and hit OK. So I come down, hit OK, right? Okay. And I expect it to be created. So when you look here now, right, at the top left, you have a database created, right? Database 1. So this is currently empty, right? No tables are here, etc. It's currently empty. We'll go through all that in creating it in a bit. So database 1, right, it's currently empty. This is the first method, right, with the graphical user interface. Another way is to use a query to create database, right? And for this, you just want a simple query, right, that says create database, the name. So you write what? Create database, and the name you want to give a database, right? Do that there. So let's see how to do that. I will make a database called database 2. So to make my query, right, when you look up here, you see this option, new query. I can click on this, right, or Control N. Or I can come onto database 1, right click, and click on what? New query, the same thing, right? If I click on this now, it opens up a query editor where I can type in my codes, right, SQL codes. So our code says what? Create database, the name, right? So I'll type in here, create database. What's the name? I'll call it database 2. So it's best practice, right? Your command in SQL, you write it in uppercase and your objects in lowercase, right? But anyhow you write it will still work. lowercase, uppercase, make sure you still work right. But best practice, you put your commands in uppercase and then put your object, right? Your table, your view, your database in lowercase, right? And then you end your queries with a semicolon like this. But with or without it, it will still work, right? But that's best practice. So let's run this and see what happens. So I run this query. So to run the query, right, I come up here, I click on execute, right? Or I click on F5 on my keyboard. Either of those should work. So I'll click on execute. And it says here what commands completed successfully, right? So let's check database folder. When I look here, I can't see my database, right? It's currently showing the first one we created. So what I'll do is I'll come onto databases, right? I'll right click and then, let me do it again. So I come on here, right click, right? And then hit refresh. So I refresh the database. And you can see, right? I can now see the database, right? Database 2 created. So we've looked at two ways, right? The interface and also using a query to make it right. So either one of them, right, works correctly. So let's go on to the next concept. So whether you create a database with a graphical interface or a query, right, it creates two files for you, which is a .mdf file. So .mdf simply means master data file, right? And this contains the actual data, right, of a databases, right? So it contains actual data. And also it creates a .ldf file, which means log data file, right? It's a log file that helps you to back up your databases. So let's say, for example, you lose data, right? You can try to recover it with the .ldf file. So let's see how we can access this file. So I would use database 1 as an example. So I come onto database 1, I right click, and I'll come down to properties, right? Properties. So I'll come down to properties, click on properties. And I'll come on to files, right? Files. So here on the files tab, right, you can see some files. And you have database name, database 1, owner, etc. So here, right, this is showing us the information for database 1. So let me zoom in so you see this clearly. So they're showing you name, file type, etc. So if I scroll to the right, you see a path, right? So this path, this and this. So one is the .mdf file, and the other is the log ldf file. So if you want to access this file, right, I'll come on here and copy this path. So this is a path on my laptop. So I'll do a Control-C, copy this. Then go on to the search bar and search for that path. This is the path, right? I enter. And it opens up this folder. So now in this folder, right, you can see database1.mdf. These are MDF file that contains the actual data. I have what's the log LDF file. The same for database 2 also, right? Database2.mdf and log.ldf. The same for all the system databases, master, model, etc. So let's go on to the next concept. So let's look at how to alter a database. So after making a database, how can you make changes, like change the name and other similar changes? So to make a change, right, we can make use of the graphical interface or use a query also. So let's say, for example, I want to make a change to the name, database 1, for example. Let's change it to database 3. So what I can do is I come onto my database, right, SSMS. So one way is to just right click on this and click on rename, right? Rename. Once you click on this, you can just change the name to database 3, for example. Right? So whilst that's going on, so you can also use a query, right? Alter database name, modify name equal to new database name. So alter database, right? Name of database, then modify name equal to the new name. So let's try and do that also. So let's use a query to do this. Let's see what happens. So for the query, it says alter database and database one. So I want to change database one to database three. Then you have modify name equal to the new name, right? Let's call it database three. So let's run this and see what happens. Let me zoom in, right? Alter database one, modify name equal database three. So basically, I'm changing the name from database one to database three. So I execute this. And it says the name has been set. So I come on here and refresh. And refresh this. And you can see, right, the change has been effected. Alternatively, right, we could use a stored procedure. Now, stored procedures are simply, you have two kinds, the system procedures and the user created procedures. So for example, you have a query that you run every day, right? And it's kind of is verbose. You have a lot of code involved in this query. So instead of writing this code every day and running it every day, right, you can just save it as a stored procedure. So now you just call that procedure and it runs that whole code. So like I said, right, you have system stored procedures and you also have those that are created by the user. So you have a system stored procedure. So this comes by default, right? And you can use this to also make changes to your DB. So this one is called what? SP underscore rename DB. So stored procedure, right? Underscore rename DB. That's the syntax. So to run this, you just run this code by execute SP underscore rename DB. In quotes, you have the old DB name, comma, and in quotes, the new DB name. So let's use this to change database 3 to database 4. Sorry, we had 1 initially. We made that 3, right? Let's change 2 now to 4. So let me use this same stored procedure, right? So I'll come on here and let's run execute SP underscore rename DB, right? And you have in quotes the old name, database 2, comma, the new name, database 4. So let me be sure we have the correct syntax, right? Yeah, cool. That looks correct. So let's run this and see what it gives us. So execute SP and rename DB, database 2, comma, database 4. This is the old name, right? Database 2. We want to change it to database 4. So let's execute this and see what happens. So I'll highlight this, right? So you can have multiple codes, right? Well, the one you highlight, that's the one that will run. So I don't want the first one to run since we've done it already. So I execute this. And it says what? Database name, database 4 has been set. So let's confirm, right? I come on here and refresh. And you can see, right? It's been altered. We now have database 4. So let's go on to the next concept, right? Deleting / dropping a database. So let's say for whatever reason, right, you want to drop or delete a database. So you can also do this via the graphical user interface or using a query. So with the query, right, the simple command, drop database name, right? And when you drop a database, right, it deletes the MDF and LDF files. So you have to be very sure and certain that it won't be used in the future, right, before you delete, because you lose both the actual data and the backup data when you delete the database. And then you cannot drop a database that's in use, right? So let's try to drop a database. So currently, right, I'm working on database tree. As you can see in this, you can see here, right? Database tree, that's what I'm working on. So let's try to drop database tree. So I can run a query that says drop database tree, right? So this query that I'm running, right, is being run on database tree. So it means that database tree is in use, right? So let's run this query and see what happens. So it says what? Cannot drop database tree because it is currently in use, right? So let's try to change the database, right? Let's try to switch to database 4. So I'll come to database 4, right click here and run a new query. So database 4, right click, now right click and new query, right? So let's try to run the same query now. Let's run the same query in database 4. It's database 4, right? Let's run this query now and see what happens. So I execute this. So it's still in use, right? So what I can do is I can close this query, right? Close this query. No. Now let's run this again now. So it should work this time. Since there are no queries being run on database tree, it's idle, right? Let's run this now and see what happens. So it says what? Commands completed successfully, right? So when we refresh this now, we expect to have database tree. Refresh. So it's off, right? So let's confirm if the MDF and LDF files have been deleted. So I'll come back to this folder, right? And when you look here, right, you see that what's database 1, the LDF files are gone. Remember, we had 1 and 2 initially, right? We renamed them. So database 1, the MDF and LDF files, they are deleted. We have just database 2 here. So let's try to delete database 2 also. So for database 4, right, we'll delete it using the graphical interface. So I come on here and right click, right? You can also delete a DB. Right click, when you scroll down, you see what delete. So I'll click on delete and it brings up this tab, right? So let's go on to hit OK. So you see I have here delete backup, close connections, right? So let's go on to hit OK. Note that database 4 is currently in use, right? So I hit OK. And it's executing. So let's see what happens. So it says error occurred, right? Because what is currently in use. So what we can do is this box here, right? You can check this box that says close existing connections. So what this does is that it closes all the processes being run on this database, right? And then drops database. So this time around, right, when we hit OK now, it should work correctly, right? And you see it's now off. And when you check the folder, right, for the MDF file, you see that what is now deleted, right? So when you delete the database, right, it drops the MDF and LDF files. And then one more thing to note is that system databases cannot be dropped. So let's try it out and see. So if I come on here, right, databases, open this up, for example. Let's try to drop master. So I right click, or let's run a query from master, new query. So I'm in master, right? Let me try to drop model and see what happens. So drop database. Note that model is not in use, right? So it should work normally. So drop database model, right? And let's run this and see what happens. So it says what? Cannot drop the database model because it's a system database. So you can't drop system databases, right? So let's go on to the next concept, creating tables. So you're done with databases, right? You have a DB. So now you want to create tables in your DB because a database without tables, right? Is basically not serving any purpose. You want to create tables, right? So for this concept, right, we'll try to create two tables, an employee table that has 4 columns, employee ID, name, email, and gender ID. And also we'll try to create a gender table that has 2 columns, gender ID and gender. Now these 2 tables, right, they are connected via the gender ID. So gender ID is the primary key in gender table. Primary key simply means is unique and is not null. It can't be empty and it must be unique, right? 1, 2, 3. So this one in gender ID, this one here, right? It can't appear multiple times on this table. It appears just once. So 1 always refers to what? Male. I can't have 1 refer to something else again. 1 is what's unique. 1 is referring to male. And primary keys help you to what? Identify what's the rows in a table, right? Now, in the same vein, this gender ID column, it also exists in the employee table. But in this instance now, it's not a primary key, right? It's a foreign key. Now, a foreign key is simply a column that exists in a different table as a primary key. So gender ID exists in gender table as a primary key. So in this table, right, gender ID exists as a foreign key. And foreign keys can be duplicates, right? They mustn't be unique. They can be duplicates and they can be null also. So in this table, for example, every ID refers to a unique gender. 1 is male, 2 is female, 3 is unknown, right? But in this table, right, you have several employees. You can have 10 males, 20 females, right, etc. So you can have duplicate gender IDs referring to different people, right? So they are duplicates and they can be nulls also. So for this 2 tables, right, we'll link them via their primary and foreign key, gender ID to gender ID. And just like other objects, right, you can create tables using the graphical interface or using a query. So let's try to create the employee table using the graphical interface. So I'll come on to SSMS. So for these, right, let's make a new database. And I'll call these DB underscore employee, right? DB underscore employee and hit OK. So DB underscore employee, that's the name of the database, right? Once you have that, hit OK. So this is my database, right? Let's try to create a table in the database using the interface. So I'll right click on this database, right? So open up the database, right? You have a folder for tables. On this folder, right, currently is empty, right? You just have folders. There are no actual objects in these folders. They're all empty, right? So let's try to make a table here. So I'll come on here, right, click on this folder, new, and I'll choose new table, right? Right click new table. So here you can put your column names, data types, and if you want it to be null or not. So let's start with the first column, right? First column is employee ID, and these are what? Integers, right? Numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first row, 1 Susan, S column 2. Let's do this. So column name, let's call these employee ID. So I like to use camel employee underscore ID let's use underscores, employee underscore ID, right? So this is a good way to name your columns. Underscores between two different words. Employee underscore ID, data type, right? So these are numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here in SQL, right, this is best represented by the integer type, integers, right? So I'll choose integers. And employee ID, right? So employee ID is a primary key for the employee table. Every employee has a unique ID, right? So it can't be null. Primary keys are meant to be what? Non-null and unique. So allow nulls, no, this column should not have null values. They should all have what? Valid values, right? The next column is what? Employee name. So I can just type in name. And for name, right, we can use varchar or text. Text or varchar should work. So let me use text for this. Text. Allow nulls, no, I don't want to have any null names. The next one is what? Email. Right. For the email, so email can have letters and words, right? So we can use varchar for this. Varchar 50, okay. Allow nulls, no, I don't want to allow nulls. And lastly, you have gender ID. And gender ID, right? Those are numbers. 1 is male, 2 is female, 3 is unknown, right? So we use integer for this also. Integer for this. And from our sample table, right? You see that what you can have null, for the gender ID, right? So for this, you can check that box that says what? Allow null. So allow null, I check the box. These are table, right? Once we're done, you can just save this. So I right click and save table 1, right? I save this. So it says a name for my table. So I'll call these employees, right? Employees table, and hit OK. So my table is created, right? When I come here and refresh this, you can see my table, right? Employee table is now created. So one thing I would like to do is I'd like to make employee ID my primary key, right? So you have to do a right click on the column. Click on the column, right click, and you see what? Set primary key. It's a primary key that uniquely identifies every employee. Every employee has a unique ID, right? So I'll choose this primary key. And I can save this also, right? Save my change. So when I open up this employee table, right? Columns, you can see what my 4 employee ID, name, email, and gender. And you can see this key icon for employee ID, meaning that what is the primary key, right? So if we want to look at the sample table, I can just come to this table, employees, right click, and just do what? Select top 1,000 rows. This is just showing you a sample of your table, right? So I click on this, and it's a sample query, right? Try to what? Choose the top 1,000 values from all the columns. You can see currently our table is empty, right? Employee ID, name, email, gender. They're all empty. There are no values in here. So let's go on to insert values into this, right? So I come to my table, employees, I right click, and here I'll come on to design, right? Design. So I click on design. I think it's what we had previously. Let me see. Okay, so let's try to add values actually. So I come on here to right click. Let me choose edit top 200 rows. Let me choose this. Yeah, so onto insert values, right? So for the first row, employee ID is 1, and the name is Susan. And the email is, let me zoom in so you see what I'm doing. So employee ID is 1, name is Susan, email is s@s.com, gender ID is 2, right? Employee ID 2, the name, let's confirm the name from the screenshot. The name is John Rico. Okay. So this John, and email is j@j.com. Gender ID is 1. Employee ID 3. Name is Rico. Email is r@r.com. Gender ID is 1, is a male also. Then you have 4. Name is Paul. Email is prp.com. And I think this is null, right? So from the data source, we don't have the gender ID for this person. And lastly, we have one last person, Kate, gender ID 3. So let's input the values for Kate. 5, name is Kate. Email k@k.com. And gender ID for Kate is, I think it was 3, right? From also 3, yeah, unknown, don't know it. So once we have this, right, you can just save it, right click here. I think it's saved automatically, right? So I enter. So when I come on here, right, let's run this query again. So go on to this query, right? Just execute it again. And let's see what, so currently, right, it's empty. If I run this again, right, I come on here and execute it again. So you see now shows what actual values, right? 1 to 5, Susan to Kate, emails, and gender IDs. So this is how you insert sample values, right, into your tables using the graphical user interface. So now let's do the same thing now with a query. So we'll try to create the gender table, but this time we'll use a query to create this, right? So let's do this. So I go back to my SSMS, and I'll make a new query for this, Please, I'll create table. My table is called gender, right? And in this table, I have 2 columns, right? First column is ID, gender ID, same thing, right? Gender ID. And this column, right, the type should be integer. It should not be empty, not null. And also it should be the primary key, right? And then we'll make another column, right, for the actual gender. So gender, and gender, right, this is text or varchar. Let's use text for actual gender. And this also should not be empty, not null, right? Cool. So this query, right, it creates a table called gender with 2 columns, ID and gender. ID has integer type, and ID should not be null. It should not accept null values. When you put null values in ID, it will give you an error, right? And then make ID the primary key. For gender column, right, it should be text type, and also it should not be empty, right? So next thing I want to do is insert values into this table, right? So insert insert into gender, right, the following values. For the ID, right, for the first column ID, you have 1, comma, and then for gender, you have what? In quotes, right? That's text, male. Then second row, you have what? 2, comma, and this female. And lastly, third row, you have 3, comma, and this unknown. So you put the text in quotes, right? So before I run the queries, let's go back to our slide and see what I do, right? So 2 columns, gender ID, gender, right? 1, 2, 3. 1 is male, 2 is female, 3 is unknown, right? The exact same thing is what I'm doing in my query. So I've made a table, right? Gender that has 2 columns, ID and gender, right? Make this table, then into this table now, right? Insert the following values. The first row, right? ID is 1, gender is male. Second row, ID is 2, gender female. Third row, ID is 3, gender unknown, right? So let's run this query. So I can run it at once, right? But let's just do it one after the other. So I'll take the first one, the first query, right? And run this, execute this, right? So it says what? Commands completed successfully. So when I check my data, refresh this, right? When I refresh this tables, right? So you can see my table gender, right? It has 2 columns, ID and gender. But currently, right, these tables are empty. And you can just confirm that by running this query. Right click, top 1000 rows. You see, right, it's currently empty. So let's run the second part of the query, right? Insert into gender, right, the following values, right? So let's execute this. So it says what? 3 rows affected, right? Let's come back here and run this query again. So I come back here, run this query again, right? So execute this. And you can see we now have 3 values, 1 male, 2 female, and 3 unknown. So we've gotten our 2 tables, right? The employee and gender. But now these tables are not connected together, right? They are currently just standalone tables. For you to connect them and make a database, you have to what? Link them together, right? Via their primary to foreign keys. So back to my slide. So we can add our foreign key references, right? Either using the graphical interface or using a query. So let's do the first method, right? Let's try using the graphical interface. So from our table, right, we've understood that what the employee table, right, contains the foreign key, gender ID, where the ID can have what? Duplicates. You see 1 multiple times. If you add more rows now, you see more 2s, more 3s. So this can have duplicates, right? But gender table, right? Gender ID here has only unique values, 1, 2, 3. So these are foreign table, employee table, which contains what? Gender ID, foreign key. These are primary table, gender table, that contains what? The gender ID, where is unique, 1, 2, 3, right? So for the interface, right, you have to go to the foreign key column. From there, that's where you create your connection, right? So I'll come to the employee table, gender ID. That's where I'll make my connection. So let's do this. Go back to SSMS. And I'll go to the foreign key table, right? Employees. Open this up. Open the columns up, right? So this is my foreign key column, gender ID. This is where I would create my connection from, right? So I come on here, I right click and click on modify, right? Modify. So it opens up this tab, right? So employee gender ID, right? I want to make my foreign key connection here. So this way I'll come on to and do a right click on gender ID. And I'll come down to relationships. So I choose relationships. Currently, right, you can see that this is empty. There's no relationship here, right? So what I can do is I can add a new relationship. So I click on add. right? And it opens up this tab, right? So I need to edit this to create what I want exactly. So I'll come on to where you have tables and column specifications. I'll click on this. Towards the right hand, right, you see this ellipsis there, right? This ellipsis there. So what we'll do is we'll click on that ellipsis. So it opens up this tab, right? You have table and columns, etc., right? So here, what's our primary key table? That's gender, right? So I'll choose gender here. And for the column, right, I'll choose gender ID. My foreign key table is employees. The foreign key column is what? Gender ID here also. So gender ID to gender ID. Once you have this right, you can hit OK. Hit close. And then I'll come on to this and save my change, right? Do a right click and say, no, not this. So the actual query, we're doing the actual change. Yeah, this, right? So we have your actual change. So I'll come on here and just save this. Save employees. The following tables will be saved to your DB. Do you want to continue? I'll say yes. So I hit yes. So now, right, if you look at the gender ID here, right, it's currently blank. When I come on here and refresh this, right, and I open it up again, you can see what you now have, what this key here, right, showing you that what you now have a foreign key connection, right, on this column. So that's for the graphical interface, right? So now let's do the same thing with the query. So what I can do is I'll need to delete this key and recreate it with a query. So I'll come on here, right click, relationships. And what I'll do is I'll just delete this, right? Add delete, I'll delete this, delete, close. And I'll save my change, right click and save this. Yes. So now when I refresh the employees table, right, the key should be deleted. Refresh this. When I open these up now, it should be blank as before, right? So let's try to recreate this now with a query. So I'll just come to, let me just edit this query. You can make a new one actually if you want to, but I'll just edit this query. So I'll take up this query and try to recreate it, right? So if you come to our slide, right, you see what you can use this query, right? Alter table. Then, so this is a function, alter table, right? Then you put your foreign key table, in our case, that's employee. Then you write add constraints. Your foreign key table again, employee, right? Underscore. What's your foreign key column? Gender ID. So employee underscore gender ID underscore FK. Then you write the keyword foreign key. In parentheses, you now put your foreign key column. That's gender ID. References, right? Then you write what's your primary key table. That's gender. In parentheses, you then put what's the primary key column. That's gender ID. That's ID in our case, right? Let's try to recreate this and see. So I have alter, let me zoom in, alter table. Our foreign key table is what employees, right? So employees. Then you have add constraints, right? Then you have foreign key table, that's employees underscore the foreign key column, that's gender ID underscore FK, right? And then you have foreign key. And then in parentheses, you have the foreign key column, that's gender ID. And then you have references, right? Keyword references. Then you have your foreign key table, that's gender in parentheses. Then you have the foreign key column, sorry, the primary key column, that's ID, right? So let's confirm that this is what we have in the query. So alter table, foreign key table, add constraint, foreign key table underscore column underscore FK. foreign key in parentheses, gender ID, references, gender in brackets, ID. Yeah, that's what we have. So let's run this. It should work correctly, right? So I'll run this query, execute this. And it says commands completed successfully, right? So what I can do is let's confirm that it worked. So I'll come back here. I expect when I refresh this, right, I should have the key pop up. So I right click and refresh this. So let's come on to the columns and you can see what's the key, right, gender ID. Alternatively, you can just come straight to what's the keys column. When you open it up, you see all the keys, right? Primary key, employees, foreign key, what's gender ID, right? So this is how you create primary key and foreign key connections. So now you can easily write queries, right, that combine both tables together. You can join them together, right, since you've made a connection. So this is how you create connections, right, between tables. So in this section, right, we're seeing how to create databases, create tables, and create connections in Microsoft SQL Server. Thank you all for your time, and I'll catch you guys in the next section. Bye.